Good morning. So again, my name is Tim Davis. I'm the director of the Utah Department of Environmental Quality. The goal of this discussion during this session is to talk about federal considerations, cooperative federalism, and the regulatory path forward. I want to jump right in and get to the discussion. So the panelists are Lee Robinson, Senior Advisor for Energy at the Defense Innovation Unit. The second is Cyrus Western, EPA Region 8 Administrator. The third is Ben Reinke, the Vice President of Global Business Development for X Energy. And the last is Jeremy Harrell, with the CEO of ClearPath. So I welcome each of you to, when I first ask you a question, to go ahead and introduce yourself with more detail if you'd like. But I want to get to the questions first. So the first series of questions for the panel are, how do we get nuclear facilities to market safely, quickly, and within budget? We just had a discussion backstage about the within budget piece, which has been a challenge over the last 28 years. So the first question, and Jeremy, I'm going to go to you, and then invite any of the rest of the panel to jump in after you, which is what can be done to reduce the cost of licensing and constructing new nuclear facilities?
Yep, thank you, and thanks to the governor for hosting this conference today. My name is Jeremy Harrell. I'm the Chief Executive Officer of ClearPath. ClearPath is a DC-based conservative clean energy organization, and our mission is to accelerate technological innovation to meet the globe's future energy and environmental needs. So what does that mean? That means scaling up new innovative technologies like advanced nuclear reactors to meet our power needs, to how do we make building blocks of the global economy like cement, steel, chemicals in an affordable and lower carbon way? And we think about that policy suite to contribute to accelerate technological innovation from soup to nuts. So basic research and development as you try to bring something out of the lab to the commercial marketplace. How do we invest in these technologies to get over that first-of-a-kind risk, improve its commercial viability? How do we get the government out of the way, the federal government, state government, and local government out of the way to commercially scale these technologies quickly here in the U.S.? And then we view the U.S. as a global leader in technology. So how do we export and promote and finance those technologies abroad? And I think we are in a really exciting moment in the United States here. I think the political support for advanced nuclear has never been higher. I think the Trump administration wants to focus and channel its energies towards it, and we're seeing immense private sector momentum, whether it's new investors into the sector, as well as some of the exciting entrepreneurs you're seeing on the stage here at this event who are deploying and breaking ground on first-of-a-kind reactors. And so in the end, what we need to do to reduce the cost is build the order book. And so I think there's a lot of momentum in Washington, D.C. on how we streamline the Nuclear Regulatory Commission's both licensing and permitting process. How do we make the government more nimble in citing these projects? How do we drive more private sector investment in place to scale them up and build the order book? And how do we invest in the supply chain? Because in the end, we do best here in the United States. We learn by doing. And as we build more and more of these reactors, we're going to see the cross curve dive significantly. And so I think that combination of early stage incentives, regulatory reforms, and investing in not only the reactor supply chain, but the fuel supply chain is going to lead to affordable, reliable, clean power for the long term for this country.
Okay, thanks, Jeremy. Anybody else want to jump in on that one? Lee, Ben?
So I'll make a quick comment on contracting structure. So first, before jumping into that, Lee Robinson with Defense Innovation Unit. For those of you that are not familiar with what Defense Innovation Unit is, it's an arm of the DoD, reports directly to Secretary of Defense. The entire reason for it being is it's trying to bring commercial technology into the federal acquisition system. The thinking is there's an iPhone out there that is great. It costs $10 billion to develop on the private sector. We should just buy iPhones and not try to make our own. We're doing that across every single technology. The technology domain that I'm in is energy, thinking about everything from batteries to microreactors, which is the most recent project that they've announced. So on how we do contracting, for the federal government to really incentivize the market, milestone firm fixed price contracting is by far the way to go. We proved this with the space industry, with SpaceX launching through NASA COTS, which was a milestone-based firm fixed price contract, and we're proving this in many, many other industries, and that needs to come to nuclear. That's actually all DIU does for contracting is milestone-based firm fixed price contracting. But this way, you give predictability to the market on when you're going to get paid, what you're going to get paid, and if you come under budget and maybe you pull in schedule, you make more money, and if you go over budget and you go over schedule, well, that's more on you and not on the government.
Okay. Thanks, Lee. Ben?
Yeah, sure thing. So I'm partially here, I guess, to talk about some government stuff. I'm a has-been, once upon a time policy guy, but today I sell nuclear reactors. The company that I work for, X Energy, is kind of a great example of what Jeremy described earlier. So we're a company, I can talk more about the technology later, but we're a company that has a technology born out of the National Laboratory System. A fuel that was demonstrated through work led by the Idaho National Laboratory and Oak Ridge National Laboratory, a lot of early R&D incentives that allowed for this technology to be developed. Then if you move forward in time, we got to a point where the US needed to start really seeding the opportunity for these advanced nuclear technologies to do what we're talking about here, which is go to market in a way that is scalable, decreased cost, and ultimately is deployable. So our program that we operate under today is part of the US Department of Energy. It's called the Advanced Reactor Demonstration Program. Chris Levesque earlier talked about the importance of that program to TerraPower. X Energy is the other recipient of the large grant. And it really enables the development of the technology all the way to complete design and then ultimately the deployment of that technology through a 50-50 cost share with the government. So taking really early development risk and bearing that partially on the federal balance sheet to be able to enable a technology to get deployed initially. So for us at X Energy, that's really helped us scale in many different ways. We are able to raise private capital against those public dollars. We've raised $1.1 billion to date in private capital to put into our technology, our fuel program, and ultimately our first reactors are being deployed with Dow Chemical in Texas. Dow pays for half of that facility and the US government pays for the other half. What does that really mean in net effect? Well, all of this is about taking a technology that is fundamentally simpler and safer and deploying it. If you go back to what Rita said earlier, some of the challenges we've seen in cost and schedule, only built, as the governor said, 2 reactors in the last really 40 years or so. Those 2 reactors were large and complex. Regulations ultimately typically mean increased cost for these designs. Usually it means increased redundancy in safety systems, but it means larger and more complex overall. And when you try to deploy a large, complex project and you haven't built anything of that caliber and size in the United States in 30, 40 years, it typically doesn't go well. So the solution for the industry has more generally been to move smaller and simpler. And simplicity is really only doable if you start with a technology that is safer than the historical technologies. So when you hear the term Generation 4, that we're a type of Gen 4 technology. Oklo is as well. Westinghouse has a Vinci technology. There are many others. But the whole point is to go to a technology that's fundamentally safe and therefore can be much simpler. If you make it smaller and simpler, you can turn the crank, repeat, and do what Jeremy said, which is really go to scale and drive the cost down.
So building off that, Ben, what can be done to reduce time, the time it takes to design, permit, and build nuclear facilities?
Yeah, I guess I gave the tee up, so I'll try to make this a bit quicker here. So when you think about time, projects have 2 really important pieces. There's a planning and design phase, right? And then there's an execution, construction, and commissioning phase. For any project, the first of a kind, that when you build that project, you ultimately are doing 2 things at once. The first is you're designing the technology itself, and you're doing all of the site-specific work to lay out the project engineering and licensing. That piece, it today is going to be a multi-year project to get all of that work done. Now, when you hear typically people talk about how much it costs to design a reactor, a good rule of thumb If it's grid scale, it's going to cost you at least $1 billion to design the reactor. Now, that's a pretty hefty, bar to clear, right? But it's not because the license requires an extremely high cost. It's because you have to design all the way down to the bolt thread size, a complex machine that ultimately has to turn on and create electricity. So that's a pretty large first threshold. But then what you want to do is in every project after that, not change the design at all. And you take that project and you go site to site, and you use the exact same license from site to site, and you should get a very tight license window. You should get a very small number of changes that are required in engineering site to site, and all of that project engineering phase gets shorter and much cheaper. And the second part of that project is execution, so that's construction and commissioning. Commissioning will always be the hardest on the first. The license will require hold points and proof of concept, a whole bunch of testing. But after the first one, commissioning gets much, much shorter and tighter. Construction also will go down. Any project that you do where you build the same thing over and over again, we know that we get ultimately savings on procurement, we get savings on installation, we get savings on learning how to do things in a much tighter window. So if you ultimately keep the design the same and you have the same delivery and deployment model, that will get shorter as well. So it's about shrinking both sides, the front end and the back end. That allows you to start turning the crank quite quickly.
Okay, thanks, Ben. Anybody else want to jump in on that time?
I'll just add really quickly, it's why this change in rising demand is so essential and why this moment is so exciting. I mean, we've had 2 decades of largely stagnant demand, and so we've been eating from the same pie. And so new generation coming onto the grid is largely leading to the retirement of something else. This exponential demand growth that we're expecting really sets the foundation for what Ben is talking about, this significant scale up, and so that we can build reactor after reactor to meet not only our urgent, immediate needs, but also start to solidify a long-term, clean, reliable, affordable grid.
Okay. Any other lessons, and Leo, I want to go to you first. Any other lessons learned from projects currently underway and or recently completed?
Sure. So I think it was Jess that probably mentioned the Project Pele project, which is the first Defense Department reactor that's going to turn on over at Idaho National Laboratory, I believe sometime next year. What that project, the lessons learned is what workforce it takes on the defense side to build in order to enable something like that. So Jess's team has, it's probably about 100 people deep of technologists that are focused on that project and also inside of OSD. And what we find is that workforce is very finite and has to be leveraged appropriately for all future projects. So we've got to find ways to do cut-throughs where, much like what Ben was talking about on the manufacturing side, on the reactor side, you have to be able to do the exact same thing over and over and over again. You have to do the same thing on the siting, on the permitting, on your each individual project, so you're not building a bespoke project from one to the next to the next. Otherwise, we're talking about building a workforce inside the Department of Defense that might be 10,000 deep, and we just can't do that.
Ben, do you have anything else you want to add on that?
Just one point that I think it dawned on me. Sometimes it's useful to look at a counterexample as a bad example. So across the pond, we have a small team in the UK that operates to look at deployment of a project in the United Kingdom. And the way that the UK has tried to go forward with new nuclear is to take a more than really a whole of government approach. They've actually tried to take the whole role of project development out of the hands of the private sector and nationalize that through something called Great British Nuclear. And today that represents, something like 400 people full-time employed, a tender that just went out, I think, for a $600 million plus contract for architect engineering, work that normally would be done by a project owner, but the government is trying to take it on themselves in a way that is taking responsibility away from the competitive side and the private sector. That's not the approach we've taken in the US. Instead, it's been put some carrots in place for the first movers to try to see what can be catalyzed in the private sector. And I think the way that we're doing things here is much, much better.
Ben, as a federal regulator, I can tell you, we're not going to try to do that.
Okay, Cyrus, that was a perfect segue to how can states and industry work with federal partners to ensure regulatory certainty, and including during the process of rulemaking? Start with you.
Thank you very much, Tim. And I really want to appreciate Governor Cox for hosting this. And I want to give a shout out to my governor, Mark Gordon, for, I think, a lot of your innovation in this arena. I mean, I'm a recovering legislator. I served for 3 terms in Cheyenne in the House, and I'll never forget that legislation coming to the floor and hearing about, what your vision was. And right now, you've been able to skate to where the puck is, and I think that says a lot, so I appreciate that. But Director, to your question, I think it's that certainty, right, that people really want. And this is something within the EP and I think within all federal agencies, and it's across industry and our partners at the state level, is just the whipsaw that you see every 4 years going back and forth. And obviously, we're all very excited about who's in the White House right now, but it is a dynamic that folks are getting weary of. And certainly a lot of the utilities I've talked with, they're getting that fatigue. And so I think it starts with, how do we have that certainty? And one of the things that Administrator Zeldin has been really clear about is, obviously, act of Congress that's the ultimate goal, right? But it is literally and figuratively an act of Congress. So, but right below that is the rulemaking process. And I think I got to give a lot of kudos to Administrator Zeldin, because he has been very ambitious about setting forward that pathway. About a month ago, he released the 40 policy points that he wants to achieve. And if you're in the utility business, some of the ones that you saw would really stick out to you: Clean Power 2.0, regional haze, ozone, MATS, PM 2.5, all these things that have been really difficult over the last decade plus, but got even harder under the last 4 years with all the additional rulemaking that went down that made it even harder. So Administrator Zeldin understands the consequences of what we're dealing with, and the consequences if we are unable to give that certainty. And one of the things that he has said is that he wants to roll out that new rulemaking package by the end of this year. And that's an incredibly ambitious goal, but I think it is a testament to his, he's fully aware of the consequences if we don't achieve that deregulatory package for states, for local government, and certainly for the folks in industry as well. So that's one of his major priorities, is giving them that certainty, because if you kind of just look at the timeline of the calendar, public comment periods, when they close or when they're allowed to appeal, we got to do this right now. We can't start this in 6 months from now or in 26 or in 27, because if we do, that durability, that lasting impact that industry really, really wants, I think especially in the nuclear sector, as this is really growing, we're not going to get it. And so I think we have a really aggressive agenda that we've set out, and I think we're already well on our way to achieving it. As we saw, obviously, with our 179B announcement that we made last month, I think that is just setting the tone of what's to come over the next 4 years.
Go ahead, Jeremy.
Yeah, I would just understand. I couldn't agree more with Cyrus, and I think this administration, urgency is the key word. They want to find ways to deploy new projects, and I think that presents a particular opportunity here for the Mountain West. As we're in and talking to folks at the Department of Energy, with Zeldin's team at the EPA, at the Department of Defense, they want to leverage federal assets. They want to use tools that they have in their tool belt to streamline permit, siting processes. They want to get innovative with the Nuclear Regulatory Commission so that they can deploy on a faster time frame and really show a tangible result here. And I think it's really incredible to see what some of the states, like the state of Wyoming and the state of Utah, have been doing to try to attract these investments, because I think they're going to be really well positioned for this moment. They want to think outside the box. They don't want, this is the way that we've done it always, is not the right answer for this administration. They want to find ways to accelerate projects, and I think we have a real huge opportunity to accelerate a next generation of American nuclear reactors in this country in the next 4 years.
Okay. And I think maybe just to kind of tag on to that, I think what can the feds do? Half of it's just getting out of the way. And I think letting the incubators of innovation, which is the states, to allow them to take the lead. And I think the fact that we are all here today in Utah shows that this region, that Wyoming, Idaho, and Utah, really are thinking outside the box, and they are walking the plank on that. And I think that is a real testament to the direction that we're heading in. I think a lot of the feedback I heard over the last 4 years is when they would call either to Region 8 in Denver at the EPA or to headquarters, no one picked up the phone. No one returned the call. And I think that's one of the things I've stressed to my staff, and Administrator Zeldin has stressed across the entire agency, is we want to get away from being super litigious about, well, this is what the reg says and that's that, versus like, hey, let's just pick up the phone and engage in soft diplomacy. If I'm in town, let's get together for lunch, or let's just sit down and talk about how you're seeing it, how we're seeing it, and where does that middle ground lie where we can just come up with solutions.
Right.
So.
And I know in Utah, we're also, I mean, we've heard that the urgency, if we want something from the administration, ask early. We gave Administrator Zeldin a whole list his first visit, and he went through it till we could tear the paper up and just say, okay, let's move on to other things, as well as that relationship piece. How do we do this together through cooperative federalism, working with EPA, but also with the Nuclear Regulatory Commission? So I want to move to the next question. And Ben, this is for you to start with. So how is the current nuclear regulatory permitting process working?
Yeah, so actually, it's working pretty well, and I know that's not what people would normally expect me to say. We've been at this with the NRC for quite some time. I think about 7 years now that we've been paying the NRC to examine X-Energy's technology, our fuel, and develop the safety case of our reactors. We submitted a construction permit application for our first project down in Texas, which will be the first of its kind in many ways. This plant is getting put on the site of an existing petrochemical facility. Now, with old technology, you might say, this is really an interesting challenge. What if the chemical plant blows up? What happens if you have a nuclear meltdown? What are the threats and the hazards of the two facilities to one another? But when you start with a technology like ours that can't melt under any scenario and has an extremely robust fuel safety case, then you can do something like that. So we'll provide direct integrated steam production into the facility as well as electric production into the Dow Petrochem facility as a drop-in replacement for 3 gas boilers that run as a cogen today. That's sort of the dream that we've always considered in new nuclear. Now, that's different in a lot of ways, right? The applicant to the NRC in this case is not an existing nuclear regulated utility that operates and owns nuclear power plants today. It's one of the world's premier petrochemical companies. And so there are unique things that we've learned, and the NRC has actually been really great in cooperating with us. Now, of course, we want things to be faster. Of course, we want to see changes to the federal statute and the underlying law that allow us to move faster with the regulator with a technology that is as safe as ours. But I would say that the NRC has been moving slowly in the right direction for quite some time. It really started in Congress with a lot of pressure. It's been multiple chairs now over different administrations, Republican and Democrat alike, that have been pushing on the staff of the NRC to be more dynamic. We hired, I guess it was pushing a year ago now, the guy that stood up the whole advanced reactor division of the NRC as our head of regulation. And he feels really, really strongly about the pivots inside of the NRC that have been made culturally to get a hit team together that knows a core technology and can move through the licensing process with the applicant. So it's a really good step in the right direction. We'll see where things go. But what drove this? From a high level, we've kind of been dancing around it here today, but what's fun to see is, generally it's probably not a positive thing, but if you look at what is going on in Congress, there are only 2 issues, I think, that are bipartisan and bicameral. And number 1 is that everybody is in it to win it against China. And number 2 is that they're pro-nuclear. And that's a huge shift in how things have really occurred over the last 10 years. But that has led to, I think, really good support around the NRC. And now it's time to make the bigger step changes with the NRC that will ultimately enable us to go to scale much faster so that they don't hinder projects in the future.
Okay, thanks, Ben. Anybody else want to jump in on general NRC processes?
I'll jump in on one piece of this. So in general, working with the federal government, yes, it is a very challenging thing because of really one core issue. Imagine selling something to a client that has a fairly long process, but then a high turnover rate. And that is true about just about any element of the federal government. There is probably a 2 to 3 year average turnover of somebody in a position. Either they're moving on or moving out of the organization. That is true that is true in the NRC, that is true inside of my own part of the organization in the Department of Defense. So one of the ways to combat that is by building a very healthy project team. So a project team that is got someone that's on the procurement side, that is buying the eventual electrons, that has the regulator, has a member of the EPA that's included in it. So when you have that turnover of the individual, which is going to happen, you don't feel it. And I think that's where, Defense Department projects on the nuclear side and many of the DOE projects have learned that we need to build this really healthy project team. Otherwise, when we have our turnover, we're basically starting over again on this very cumbersome process.
Okay.
I would just add that the modernization effort at the NRC, which really began about 10 years ago, first legislation got across the finish line to kind of kickstart a new licensing process and do some new forms. Congress came together last Congress to pass overwhelmingly another package last July that was signed into law to continue that push. I think we're seeing a lot of significant steps. I think they're working well with some of the early movers. And we're having to solve some new right-sizing issues that need to come about. Some of the innovative technologies that you're hearing from today have different safety benefits, and so the work that the NRC needed to do to prepare for gigawatt-scale reactors that are operating across the country today is superfluous for some of this next wave of reactors. Especially as we look at microreactors, for example, and the ability to site those in places closer to population centers because of both the safety and the economic upside of them. I think Ben alluded a little bit earlier to a streamlined process. With nuclear, you don't need to do a full EIS. You're not choosing an alternative site for new nuclear reactors, and you characterize some of these areas. And I think that's why it's so great to see what, like Utah and Wyoming, for example, been doing. I think we've heard a lot of stories about the four communities in Wyoming that were competing for the TerraPower reactor. Put together a few sites that are ready to build and get those communities excited. And I think you're going to see many of these leading reactor developers jump in, move forward, and I think you're going to see an NRC that's ready to move with them and get this next wave of reactor built.
Okay, thanks, Jeremy. So what is the status and timeline for NRC's Part 53 rulemaking, which will create a regulatory process or framework for advanced nuclear reactors? Since Ben, you're under Part 50, I think, currently, but this will be the new rulemaking that will be designed just for advanced reactors.
Yeah. This should be the rulemaking for the future, right? And I think the benefit of how much momentum there has been, private sector momentum there has been in this industry since the legislation that kickstarted this process about 10 years ago started is the early movers are going through the current process, the Part 50 or 52 pathway. 53, we need to get right and have it be the pathway that allows us to rapidly scale new reactors. And so the NRC is working diligently on this. There's been a lot of industry and NGO feedback to get it right. And in the end, I think it needs to show significant upside that shows like once you've gone through the process, this is the way that you can rapidly scale reactors. So I think we're going to see that start to get finalized over the next year, next 18 months or so. And the hope is that is kind of the blast off point from a regulatory standpoint.
Okay, thanks, Jeremy. Lee, did you have more on that?
The NRC folks that are involved in Part 53, they're actually using the Advanced Nuclear Power for Installations program through DIU as the first of a kind. So they want to validate, they already have the draft regulation that's out, they want to validate their regulatory landscape by doing it first at a military base. Still TBD, potentially an Air Force base in the near area, potentially a Army base on the East Coast. So by working together those two segments of government, what we should have is a pretty clear, well-defined regulation that can be used across national security priorities for the Defense Department, but also for the commercial priorities through the NRC.
Okay, so thank you. Then the next topic that I want to address are just those addressing misconceptions with nuclear power, providing transparency, communicating the safety advancements of advanced nuclear reactors. So let me start with what efforts are being made to bring citizens along as partners in process of siting, licensing, operating nuclear reactors. And let me start with you, Cyrus, and then move from there.
I think part of it is just, like I've said before, it's trying to streamline that and get out of the way and see, what can we do in that part of that process. If you look at the Department of the Interior with the BLM and what they've done to streamline some of that mining process, I mean, that's pretty exceptional what we've seen even in the last couple of months come out of there, right? And so I think that sets a really great template and blueprint of how can we emulate that and really streamline these processes. Of course, we want to make sure that it is safe, that it's reliable, that public health is protected. That's part of our mandate as an agency. But at a high level, that's very much the administrator's approach when he looks at these types of projects at a high level.
Okay. Anybody else? Jeremy, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, I would say that it's incumbent on us as an industry to go on offense and tell the great story that nuclear can have in these communities. I mean, we see time and time again across the United States, the public support for nuclear is highest in the communities that host reactors. They see the significant tax base that is in place. They see the investments that the operators in those communities are making in their schools and in their communities. They're seeing the high-paying jobs. And we need to show that and tell that story. And I think, unfortunately, and I consider myself part of the industry, even though I'm the CEO of an NGO, we've shied away from telling those stories. And I think there's going to be an incredible narrative in this next generation reactor. We're going to be broadening the aperture across the country of places where we can deploy. There's going to be new off-takers. Ben was talking about Dow Chemical, DOD, the role that it can play at DOD. Lee was talking. I mean, nuclear can play an instrumental role in our national security, in our economic growth, and in our climate future. And we need to lean into that as a whole. I mean, and we're seeing this change drastically globally as well. So we commissioned some polling across the globe with an organization called Potential Energy, and you see in Eastern Europe, in Japan, a decade after Fukushima, nuclear above water in the approval ratings, right? Over 50%. In Eastern Europe, well above 60%. People see the economic upside and the environmental upside. And I think that's really what has changed this moment and why we've seen this big bipartisan support in DC and across the country and in this state as well, which is why the legislature has really leaned into it. People see the economic benefit, they see the environmental and the climate benefit, and they see the national security benefit.
Yeah, I'll rag on our industry a little bit further. So thanks, Jeremy, for teeing that up. Look, fundamentally for 30 years, the posture our industry has had has been mostly, if we keep our heads down, they'll let us keep operating the 104 to 108 reactors that we have in the United States, and that'll keep 20% of the grid on, and that's really great news, and that's good enough. And it's not good enough anymore, and we've known that for a long time. I think the pivot has begun. At X-Energy, we typically like to not show up in the community and just say, hey, we're here to bring you a nuclear reactor, but we do have to find ways to communicate better. It's not a surprise to anyone that nuclear engineers, on average, are pretty poor communicators. I think that's true of engineers writ large. Nuclear is usually in the bottom 5% of engineers. So when we show up and we talk about our safety case, we need to think about it in a different way. It's no longer, hey, trust me, the stats show that nuclear is safe because, and this is a great talking point, and you heard it here multiple times today, that because nuclear power plants have demonstrated that they're as safe as any other technology over an extended period of time because, of course, I think as Rita Baranwal put very well, because it's a highly regulated industry. We have very strong rigor there. But that's also the same type of challenge that we've faced when you get on an airplane and TSA has standards and the airplane explains to you that it's safe, and in case of an accident, here's how we behave. Those are all true things, and we need to continue to tell that story, but we have to start talking about things a bit differently too, and we need to lean into the safety case of some of these technologies. They're built from the inside out, and they're built in a way that cannot have a catastrophic incident. And so then we need to focus on the benefits, as Jeremy said, about what these technologies bring. So the last thing, when we go to a community, we typically let our customers bring us there. It's their community. So down in Seadrift, Texas, Dow brought us into that community. I think there's been really strong positive reception. It's not a nuclear community. There's a nuclear plant about 45 miles away. But it is a heavy industrial community, and people in that community are used to having large industrial facilities. In our second project in the state of Washington, Amazon is the owner and anchor investor of that project. Amazon feels customer interaction in a way that we don't at X-Energy, and frankly, almost nobody in this room does. In my house, 3 times a day, boxes show up with Amazon on the side. That's probably a personal problem and one that my wife shares with me. But that means that we have a touch point with the Amazon brand on a daily basis. And so the way that they think about customer interaction is different. And so leaning into a safe, fundamentally safe nuclear technology and looking at the upside and benefits is how Amazon communicates about this. And so we're trying to work with them on that new story.
Anything else on the safety and how to communicate it? Because I agree, I don't know that always the state or federal regulators are the most trusted messengers when we come and say, trust me, it's safe. And I think you're saying, Ben and Jeremy, also it's not always the proponents of and the industry. I do think we've got at least one mayor here, and I like the idea of going to communities that are requesting this, really starting there, showing the safety over time, proving that it's safe over time, and the communities that want and are advocating for it, making sure that the process is transparent. Don't hide from public comments and concerns, but really talk about the safety measures that are built into advanced nuclear is the key. So
yeah, it's an and, right? So
yeah.
we have to tell the story we've told here today, and we have to talk about the other benefits that are out there too.
Exactly. So I want to jump into a couple other questions, and a couple of you have talked about this, Ben and Lee in particular, but what is the role of public investment, public-private partnerships, tax incentives, loan guarantees to support, really launch the industry, to support innovation in the private sector without distorting the market?
I'm happy to start there since I'm the policy guy from DC. It plays a really important role in bridging the gap, especially this early stage investment needs to happen to ramp up investment in this country. And then the government needs to get out of the way, and we'll attract private capital, we'll scale quickly, but as we get in this early stage, it's going to play a really important role. And so something that I would urge you all to pay close attention to, and the Utah delegation has been great on this. You've got strong leaders, and particularly Senator Curtis, Congresswoman Malloy, and Congressman Blake Moore, who's on the Ways and Means Committee. The reconciliation bill is going to be a big piece of this. So the technology neutral tax credit, which is an investment tax credit for new generation, really important for first of a kind and this first wave of advanced reactors. It's really important that incentive stays in place in some shape or form over the next decade. So that we can drive more private sector investment into these early stage reactors. I think they are looking at tweaks to the DOE's loan program to find ways to build the order book, to do a little bit of a backstop on some of the cost potential for this, project 2 through 5, 6. The Trump DOE has been pretty clear that they want to use that tool to make investments in the supply chain, and Secretary Wright has a really strong passion around this. He used to sit on the board of Oklo. You guys heard from Jake earlier, and so he knows this industry well and wants to push forward. And so that bill, which is going to be in the works over here over the next 3 months, really going to be important to see how resources are invested in this sector and if some of these tax incentives stay in place. And then carrying forward some of these big central programs or being able to leverage the DoD as a customer, for example, is going to play a really important piece of it too. The Allison Air Force Base RFP, for example, could be an early deployment. Lee talked about Project Pele, really important that stays on track. And I think we're going to be able to leverage those successes here for a takeoff that's going to be private sector driven in the not too distant future.
Lee, your DoD was mentioned, so jump.
Yeah, if I could add on to that. So I'll speak mostly from the perspective of the Department of Defense. So we're one of the largest consumers of electrons around the world. We run 500 installations, mostly in the US. They all look like a bunch of little towns. So we really can provide two things to this industry. One is first of a kind mover. So you can house a microreactor or an SMR on a base, provide power to a data center, and then provide about 10 megawatts of continuous electricity to our critical infrastructure. We're doing that right now. We're trying to have that on our first base by 2030 with then multiple thereafter. That does two things. Not only do you then catalyze the industry, the other is we're doing this right next to where we live. So we have confidence in those nuclear reactors that they are inherently safe, that we're willing to put it within miles of our elementary schools and our homes. And when we do that, we have to be very public about it because these towns look like just like any other town around America. The only difference is half the people in that town wear a uniform.
Okay.
Yeah, I just want to add one quick last comment, which is fundamentally what we're talking about is access to capital. And historically, because of the footfalls we've had in the nuclear industry, and because of the high burden of regulation, the need to spend $1 billion to design a reactor that is grid scale before you can take it to market, those are high hurdles to clear. So the public incentives have really helped catalyze a lot of private investment. I think that's what we're seeing. That we do need those to stay in place. And ultimately, it's capital. We need to see the sources of capital that have been diving into gas deployment and renewables deployment now pivoting into nuclear. We're starting to see the early signs of that. Just to give you an example, in recent fundraising rounds, we've had some large sources of capital, pension funds, non-traditional large asset managers that have $400 billion under asset management jumping in. Those are early good positive signs, but simple PPAs in the early days are not really enough to move the needle. And so customers that bring capital to bear, and that's what DIU can potentially do, we're very supportive of that program. But similarly, we've gone to end users to join our projects like Dow and Amazon, because there are not a lot of utilities that are able today to take that jump. And so it's really about unlocking sources of capital, mostly the equity portion, to get moving on a project.
Okay, thanks, Ben. Lightning round. As the Chief Environmental Officer for the state of Utah, I want to ask you just really quickly, what is the one thing that the state of Utah could do, other than having a champion in the governor, to help get advanced nuclear to Utah? So I'll start with you, Jeremy, and we'll just work down the line.
Stable regulatory environment. Predictability attracts capital.
Okay, thanks, Jeremy. Ben?
I would totally agree with what Jeremy said.
Okay.
I would say continue to do what you've done, which is telling us how specifically we can get out of the way and let you guys do your job best.
Okay, thanks, Cyrus.
I'd say continue events like this, incredibly helpful, and then start on site preparation. Get that started for when the reactors do come in.
Okay, thank you all. Thanks for your time and your thoughts, and I think it's lunch, so.